I'm Algenon Cash, and you're locked in. Welcome back to another episode. As always, I've got another great guest for you today. Jon Lowder is going to be joining us, president of the Piedmont Triad Apartment Association. We're going to be talking about this looming eviction crisis that so many people are talking about all around the country. But before we do that, we also always got to make sure that we highlight and recognize those people that are supporting the show. And as usual, I like for you to know about my friends so that you can support my friends and my friends can support what we do. As you can imagine, it takes a tremendous amount of energy and work to pull these shows together and make sure we're doing the proper research to give you the content that you need and want and deserve, and so that we can keep you educated. And so Angela Harriet over at Keller Williams is our sponsor for this episode. And if you're thinking about buying or selling a home, this is a very hot real estate market right now. I want you to call Angela Harriet. She's at Keller Williams. You can go check out her Facebook page. Go follow her Facebook page. She's actually doing something really unique this holiday season. She's giving away a holiday meal that feeds up to 6 people this season. So if you want to enter for a chance to win that holiday meal, go to Angela Harriet's Facebook page. Look for Harriet Properties. There'll be some instructions on how you need to text the word free meal to a certain number, like the page, sign up for that drawing, and you could win a free holiday meal for up to 6 people. That's next week. But that's Angela Harriet who is sponsoring the show. And if you're interested in being a sponsor, make sure you reach out to me. We've got all types of ways that you can get involved, whether you want to be a sponsor or just a contributor. One thing you can do that doesn't cost you any money is that you can like and share this episode if you like what you hear. And you can also go out to YouTube and make sure you subscribe to the channel. So as we're producing new content, you'll get a notification and you'll know all about it. And we are just about at the tail end of wrapping up the setup for our new podcast, Locked In, which will be available on Apple, Spotify, and I think some other platforms out there as well. So hopefully we'll have a big announcement, maybe even tomorrow, in terms of you being able to go and starting to download the Locked In podcast. So we got a lot of things we're working on, but we cannot do it without you. So you're locked in. I'm locked in. Jon Lowder, he's locked in. Welcome back to the show, Jon.
Thanks, Algenon. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, you heard me say at the opening that it's a really hot real estate market right now, especially if you want to buy or sell a home. But it's not doing so hot right now for the folks that might be renting a place. And just to give my audience a little bit of context as to what we're going to talk about today, we are really facing an interesting crisis here in our country. Nearly 40 million people, 40 million Americans could face eviction over the next several months. The only thing holding them back right now is the CDC's eviction moratorium order and a patchwork of state and local protections for renters that are set to expire on December 31st. The CDC's eviction moratorium was supposed to protect renters in all 50 states through the end of the year, keeping COVID-affected renters in their apartments. And the CDC said that would reduce the potential for virus transmission likely to occur as displaced people were forced to move in with family or friends or into homeless shelters. But nationwide adherence to the moratorium has been a little bit spotty, according to housing experts. And the number of evictions that have been processed while the moratorium is still in place is a preview of what some experts predict will be a wave of homelessness when the CDC moratorium expires on December 31st. Access to congressional funds earmarked for rental assistance also ends then, programs that have helped landlords as well as renters. And so this is a really interesting conundrum that we find ourselves in. I wanted to invite Jon Lowder in. Jon is the president of the Piedmont Triad Apartment Association, and he is working not only with the industry, being the owners and the landlords and property managers, but he's also working with housing advocates to try to find a solution to this looming crisis. Jon, I'm certain you're working overtime these days with everything you do over at the association.
Yeah, it's been, I tell people all the time that, in the grand scheme of things, it's a good problem to have in the sense that I have a job, and that it is easily the busiest I've been in my career. Unfortunately, the busyness comes from, it's great having a job, and I love my job, but the busyness comes from a pretty negative space, which is that we are dealing with from all sides. We're dealing with a real housing problem, and we had and you and I have talked about this in the past. We had a housing crunch before this all started. We have not built enough housing to keep up with the demand. And the Triad is fortunate in that we are primed to grow economically. We have been growing, and in a weird way, our slower growth than other places like Charlotte and Raleigh has benefited us in that we don't have as much of a housing shortage as we would have if we had a whole lot more in migration, more population growth. But that being said, when COVID hit, that really threw gas on the fire. And you take an existing housing, you mentioned the really hot for sale housing market. Well, there's a reason it's hot, and that's because not enough housing was built. So there's not enough supply for the people who want to buy. For the particular crisis that we're dealing with now, it's really, I think it's important for people to understand that when you talk about rental housing, not all just like not all for sale housing is the same, not all rental housing is the same. So we have, you have the higher end of the market, the brand new spanking new places you've seen, especially downtown. They're going for a couple $1,000s a month in rent. But then you have the other end of the spectrum, which are the workforce housing. And that is where most of the problem is, because that's the housing that serves the service sector, an area that you're very familiar with. And the service sector is what's been hammered by this pandemic. Every part of the economy has suffered, but I think you'd be hard pressed to find one that suffered more than the service economy. So, the housing that serves those folks, from their perspective, the good part is that they have been in their housing. The moratorium did keep them in housing. Even before the moratorium, I can tell you that a lot of landlords, it was in their best interest to negotiate and to try to come up with partial payment plans, and they did. A decent, pretty good percentage of folks did come out with payment plans and work with residents, keeping them in place. Waived late fees, extended payment deadlines, did whatever they could. But the reality is now we are 8-9 months into this thing, and folks who haven't been able to pay their rent since, March, or even some of them even before that, you're now looking at 8, 9, 10 months of rent, and that's bad for everybody. It's bad for the person who owes it. It's bad for the landlords, especially those landlords who maybe don't have that many units to spread if you have 1,000 units and you have 2 people who haven't paid their rent, that's a very different outlook than if you have 3 units and one person hasn't paid their rent for that amount of time.
Yeah. I want to try to jump in there, John. Make sure I steer the conversation a little bit.
Yeah.
To go back to the order, the moratorium itself, and I've been reading some different articles, and some of this might not be completely specific to North Carolina, but some of the articles I've read, certain tenants are still being evicted in spite of the CDC moratorium. How is that possible?
So the moratorium really, it only applies to non-payment of rent. So that's a great point that you're bringing up, Algenon. There are multiple reasons that somebody could be evicted. And some of them are beneficial to the other residents, especially in a multifamily dwelling. So say you have somebody in an apartment and you have known criminal activity or dangerous activity of some kind, they could be evicted for that. If they have multiple people living that aren't on the lease, living in the property off the lease, and that they're breaking their lease, they could be evicted for that. In this scenario, I don't think they would be, just because it's because of the situation we're in. But that's why. I will say also that there is a patchwork of these things going on out there. So we spend a great deal of time. I can't tell you how many webinars we have hosted for our members to try to explain what applies now, what doesn't apply now. Because on top of the CDC moratorium here in North Carolina, Governor Cooper came out with his own moratorium, and essentially it extended went beyond what the CDC moratorium did. So, it allowed more people to qualify for it. The other thing that's happening is, because it's so confusing, there are, and I'm not going to say I really can't imagine anybody from my world. Most of the professionally managed large multifamily properties, they have the wherewithal to train their people. They have a corporate headquarters that they can access, who's responsible for making sure they're up to speed on all the regulations. But if you have somebody who's a small, they own their own properties, they don't have a professional management company involved, they're just doing the best they can. They may not even be aware of that they're breaking the law. And residents may not be aware that it applies to them. The interesting thing about to me, the scary part about the CDC moratorium was it was done so quickly. It was especially in the early days back in August and September. It was very unclear, like what the penalties were for if a resident has to attest to certain conditions for the moratorium to apply to them. So they have to have been affected. They had to have lost their job or their income. They had to have been, there are 3 or 4 things. I don't have it in front of me, but there are 3 or 4 things that they had to be able to essentially attest that they were impacted by COVID, and that's why they were at risk of losing their housing. From the landlord's perspective, they had to accept that, and what that does, it keeps the person in their housing. It doesn't stop the process necessarily. It doesn't keep them from eventually being evicted if they haven't paid their rent or if there's another reason for being evicted. But it does kind of freeze everything where it is.
Yeah.
So that there are all kind. Every situation is different. You talk to any attorney, they will qualify everything they say by saying, "Well, it all depends," and it really does, because each case it has different specifics involved.
Well, and when you think about the legal side, there seems to be a differing opinion out there amongst the legal community on whether or not these moratoriums are even constitutional. Has the Apartment Association done any work in that regard? I mean, do y'all have an opinion on whether or not these moratoriums are constitutional?
Well, I don't personally. I didn't even sleep in a Holiday Inn Express, so I can't. I don't have an opinion, a legal opinion. I will say the National Apartment Association did join in one of the lawsuits essentially to challenge the CDC's wherewithal. It was considered a lot of landlords consider it kind of a taking. You're essentially losing the control of your property. But I will say this. I mean, it's the other issue with the moratorium is we're coming at everything from a very negative. It's all negative, right? It's the folks who are in the housing yet can't pay their rent. At some point, they have the stress of knowing that at some point that moratorium is going to end. The landlord is continuing to amass a certain amount of bad debt. They have their own bills they have to pay, and like I said, it's a totally different game for a very large corporate landlord. I mean, believe me, it still impacts their business, but they can spread that pain out over a larger pool of essentially operations. For the folks that own 3 or 4 houses or a couple of duplexes, a couple of condos, whatever they're doing, and they're renting those out, and they have half their residents can't pay the rent. And quite frankly, that is a far larger share of the folks who provide affordable housing and workplace housing than are the larger corporate providers. The affordable housing, the naturally occurring affordable housing, tends to happen in those smaller apartment communities. Yes, there are large ones. Yes, there are, and we all know, we've driven through town and we've seen some of the larger affordable housing. But if you aggregate it all together, it's those small operators who provide more of it. So they're the ones who are really getting hurt by this. So it's bad for everybody. What we've been advocating for. So when I said the National Apartment Association joined in one of the lawsuits, they also, and we've been a big part of this, we've been advocating strongly from day one for rental assistance. We need rent payment assistance because that what that does is that helps everybody involved. It helps the resident. It helps the landlord. The landlord is able to meet their obligations. They have expenses too, and part of those expenses are
Yeah.
the upkeep of the property for these people to live in. So it just is the best solution.
I do want to talk about rental assistance, but before we get too deep there, I want to try to stay focused on the
Okay.
tenants. Um, you talked about the patchwork of eviction policy. And maybe COVID has revealed this, but have we reached a point where we just need a federal eviction policy versus having this patchwork of state and local that currently exists? Or
Algenon, I don't know if that's, I don't know enough about the law to know if that's even possible. I think what we learned through the COVID process is where the federal government has a say is where, what they can do, or they can do. One of the reasons that they've had, I don't know, the legal term may not be right, but, kind of they've had standing is if you have a HUD loan, if you have a federally backed loan, then that's where the CARES Act moratorium. So remember, before the CDC moratorium, we had the CARES Act moratorium. That one affected properties that were federally backed, that had federal money. Now, that's a significant number of properties. I mean, that's roughly a third of the properties of multifamily properties out there. If you include those single family homes that are owned and rented out, it's much larger. So I don't know what the overall percentage of real estate is backed by federal loans, but it's gigantic. And so they could, if they wanted to, I think through HUD policies, they could probably get that done. But I don't know that you could do a blanket federal across all property, because most real estate, and this is, I mean, getting a little into the weeds, but most real estate law is local, state and local. That's the federal laws tend to affect you when it's things like environmental quality, but say even utilities, that's a state level regulation. That's not a national regulation. So I would imagine that it would be very difficult to do unless it was federally backed properties.
I understand, and I think I was thinking more, and I totally agree. I mean, you got your Fannie Mae, your Freddie Mac, back mortgage-backed securities, and then obviously you got your FHA financing, and there's even some other government programs that actually get into housing finance as well. And but I was thinking about, if you had a federal eviction policy, if maybe that would just tie it in and make it much more simple. So all landlords, whether you operate across state lines or whatever you're doing, if
Right.
it just made it more simple for you. Right now, it seems like, or at least statistically, they're reporting that about 18% of all tenants are behind on payments.
Mhm.
On average, how much are you seeing tenants behind right now on their rental payments?
It depends. Obviously, it depends on the market. I think here around here would be a little bit lower than say it would be in a market like San Francisco or one of the really large major metros. The average rent here owed would be a little less than Charlotte because our rents are lower per month. But if what the numbers I've seen nationally are $5,500 per household of the folks who are behind, not of all households, but of the folks who have not been able to pay rent. 5,500 is the number that we're seeing on a national level, and that sounds about right. That, I mean, if you take it and say the average person is behind 6 months, and I think that 5,500 might include utilities too, but say they're behind 5 or 6 months, average rent, especially at the workforce housing around here, it's $600, $700 a month. In larger metro markets, it's going to be more like $1,000 a month. So it sounds about right.
No, I think that's really interesting, and obviously that's creating big debts for
Mhm.
a good portion of the country. And I was even reading a New York Times article that said that if you took all tenants across the country and combined them, the aggregate number for behind payments would be somewhere around $32 billion. So it's a significant number, and it makes you wonder whether you have this moratorium in place or when it goes away, those bills come due. Either way you look at it, and for a lot of these tenants, it's going to be hard to figure out how to dig out. And then the problem exacerbates itself when tenants actually do get evicted, because once you get evicted, it becomes very difficult for you to go find other housing.
Mhm.
Now you've got an eviction on your record, that sort of puts a scarlet letter on you, and other
Right.
landlords don't want to work with you. I was also reading something today that says if 1/4 of the people who are evicted wind up in homeless shelters, taxpayers could face $130 billion in costs for emergency medical treatment, foster care, shelter, and juvenile delinquency services. So it also sounds like the cost of not supporting these people far outweighs the cost
Yeah.
of actually trying to keep them in their homes and not part of the homeless population. You talked about rental assistance. I do want to shift gears a little bit and get on the landlord side. You talked about
Mhm.
rental assistance. I know in this big great debate around housing, that's probably the piece that doesn't get talked about as much. Obviously a lot of people are more concerned and thinking about how do we keep people in their homes and their apartment units and so forth. But a lot of people don't think about the fact that the landlord themselves also has a mortgage payment
Right.
and maintenance costs and these
Yeah.
other things that this revenue goes toward. Do you have any idea, on average, how behind in mortgage payments multifamily owners might be right now? Or
I don't. It's been, I will tell you, it's been, everybody's so busy just trying to keep everything afloat that when we do research, it's a bit like pulling teeth to get folks to just be able to carve out the time to respond to surveys and that kind of thing. Um, Again, I suspect that the real problems at the with the smaller operators, because I think they're more leveraged than some of the larger companies. Um, Also, you to be perfectly blunt about it, a lot of our members are dealing in those Class A, Class B properties, and they are seeing problems. It's just not as widespread as the folks who are doing the Class C housing. So when I do a survey, I have to be really careful to kind of pull out the data that and make sure that we're looking at apples to apples. Um, I again, I suspect that the real problems are going to be with the small operators and the mom. That it sounds derogatory to call somebody mom and pop. It's actually, to me, that's a term of endearment. I mean, these are the folks who, they live and breathe their property business, and they have nowhere to hide. And it's not just their mortgage. They have taxes, they have utilities that they're paying. If they have employees, they're paying their employees. If they have maintenance costs, if the roof goes, if they need to patch the roof, if the HVAC goes, whatever might be going on, they've got to pay for that. So it's a widespread effect on them. We do have research, related to this that shows what the profit margin is for the average multifamily development, and it's about 9%. So
mm,
there's not a lot of, it doesn't take, I'm an English major, I'm not a math major. And even I can do the math and say, okay, if I'm working on a 10% margin and all of a sudden my debt load is looking like, or my bad debt is at 15%, I'm underwater all of a sudden. So it really is a significant issue.
you talk about the large landlords that might probably own 20, 50,000 units. I know you got Carroll companies.
Mhm.
You've got what's the other big group out of Greensboro?
Bell
The
Partners.
Bell
Yeah.
Partners. So I
Yeah.
think they might own 200,000 units. So
Right.
you've got the big companies that own these really massive amounts of units, and then you talk about the mom and pops, and I agree with you. I think that's a term of endearment that may own a much smaller number of units. Talk a little bit about the gap in community engagement too, right? Like it would
Mhm.
seem to me if you're a large owner, you own 50,000 units all around the country, compared to the mom and pop who might own 3 units just in their backyard. Is there some kind of gap in how you deal with the large owners versus the more smaller owners that are a little bit more attached to the local community?
Yeah, it's the I would say the way that it's different to engage. Well, first of all, we have a unique situation here in the Triad, and that is we have a lot of companies headquartered here relative to the size of our market. So, to be a quote unquote secondary, tertiary market like ours, and to have a Bell Partners and to have an RE Carroll and to have a Blue Ridge Companies and to have a Hawthorne Residential Partners. I mean, these are large-ish companies. Have all of them right, headquartered within miles of each other is a little odd. What that means though is they are heavily engaged in our community here too. So they are a little bit different. What I would say is different in dealing with them when I am dealing with folks at the state level, when I'm dealing with folks at the national level, we tend to get more feedback and input from those larger companies. When I'm dealing with stuff at the local level, and when you're talking when city council's involved, or when you're getting calls about inspectors, being a little too picky, or whatever their complaint or worry might be, that tends to be more of the smaller operators. And they also, I think they're all though really invested in the community. I mean, we just finished a food drive for Second Harvest, and we got a lot of engagement from that. When we do really any kind of community outreach, we get engagement there. To me, the single biggest difference is I really do get more calls saying, what does this all mean, from the smaller operators? Because they don't have a staff attorney, or they don't have a CFO that they can turn to and ask, questions about these complicated issues. And so that's where that tends to be the difference, is they just don't have the same resources available to them that the larger operators do. And that's what I meant by, if they are far more likely to have made an honest mistake when it comes to understanding what's going on in the legal or regulatory environment right now than the larger operators. The larger operators, they're spending a good deal of time and money on training, making sure their people don't do something they're not supposed to do. The smaller operators, they're just trying to pay the bills. They're just trying to keep everything going. And they may or may not know about something like the eviction moratorium. So I think they are all invested in the community. I do think the other difference is the larger companies actually, they can give their folks time to do volunteerism. The small mom and pops, they might be so busy, they may or may not be able to do more volunteer work, but they are all, I will say, they're all invested in the community because they're all directly affected by it.
Well, and I want my audience to know as well, I mean, that the actual rental revenue that comes in, whether you're a small operator or a large operator, it does have a multiplier effect in our local economy. I mean, most times these people are hiring local plumbers, local HVAC repairmen. There's some landscaper in town that's actually mowing the grass at that property. When something breaks, they're using a local supplier. And so these operators, small or large, are making considerable investments into our local economy. And those revenues also go towards property taxes. And property taxes is what funds these essential public services that we have, whether it's sanitation or transportation or public safety or healthcare, and all these various things that people have come to rely on in your backyard and in your community. These operators and these owners are funding through their property taxes. And so it does become really important that we figure this out. Obviously, we need to figure it out because we don't want anyone to go homeless. But we also need to figure it out in terms of keeping these people in business, because it could have a detrimental impact to our local and state economy, quite frankly, because even state government relies on these operators. And I think that's what you mean when you talk about the rental assistance program, where versus looking at an eviction moratorium, which only just sort of keeps kicking the can down the road in terms of accruing balances for these tenants. A rental assistance program would actually mobilize dollars and allow these tenants to pay their rent as they go. But then it also allows the operator to be able to keep making the investments and doing what they need to do in terms of taking care of their assets and paying the property taxes and doing those kind of things. I know right now Congress is debating, they're debating a big $900 billion aid package. Last I heard, they have included about $25 billion in there for rental assistance, but they also want to extend the moratorium through January. So if this is one of my last questions for you, Jon, but if this gets approved over the weekend, I heard they're going to be debating it through the weekend, may go into action sometime next week. How does your industry feel about that? I mean, it has the rental assistance component that you've talked about, but it also extends the moratorium for another 4 weeks.
I think as long as rental assistance is there, the moratorium is far less problematic. It's far less worrisome to everybody. That's been the hang up all along. That it's really, look, I don't think anybody likes being told how to run their business, but at the same time, it is a whole lot easier to swallow that pill if it's accompanied by a cup of juice known as rental assistance. So there's this misunderstanding out there, this misperception that landlords are running around wanting to evict people, and that's just not true. It's bad for business. If I listen, if I evict you, once you're out of there, I still have to clean that apartment. I still have to get it ready. It's going to be out of commission for a month while I'm getting it ready, and then turn around and then run it again. So by evicting you, I'm costing myself, in addition to whatever you owed me, I'm costing myself another month of revenue to get somebody in there. So it's just a false perception that there's this desire to evict people. The what they're trying to do is run their business, and they're trying to do it. You don't go into a grocery store and expect to walk out with free groceries, right? That's kind of the mindset. Is we're providing a service, we're providing a place to live, and in return we are getting rental income. And when that stops happening, what if it happens enough, then all of a sudden everybody else's rent goes up, because I've got to cover these costs that I have anyway, right? One way or the other, I got to cover the cost. So to your point, the rental assistance, if the rental assistance comes through, the moratorium is that's far easier to accept. Honestly, Algenon, if I'm a betting man, what's going to happen is this package is going to come through. Our folks are telling us from Washington are telling us the same thing. What you've heard is correct. Everybody's pretty much accepting of it. I'm going to speak specifically here for North Carolina. I think that's a minimum that's going through the end of January. I think realistically, especially with the Biden administration coming in, we're much more likely to see that eviction moratorium go out a little further. And that's because we're nowhere close to coming out of this. I think those of us who pay attention to it know that when I say the pandemic. So we're likely to see an extension, and the next job is to make sure that there is more rental assistance coming, because that 25 billion gets us started. But that number you mentioned was $30 billion already. So we need to, because that's the other thing. It's one thing, I need to make sure that the rent that's covered is all their old debt too. So that, you're not asking somebody you're not asking landlords to essentially carry the weight of 4 months of back debt or something like that. So the next step will be another round. And I fully expect once, this is a lame duck Congress, once the next Congress is seated, fully expect they will be working on another package. And hopefully they'll get it all worked out. And again, if in the end, it's a bit like making sausage, it's not pretty, but if in the end we get to the point where there's enough rental assistance to cover everybody, if the moratorium goes out, will the folks from the housing provider side be dancing? No, but they'll be fine. It'll be, from an advocacy standpoint, I think what we're looking for most, the top priority is that rental assistance. That's the top priority.
Well, Jon, as always, I appreciate you being so kind and liberal with your time and locking in with me and then helping my audience better understand what's really going on out there. Because I think so many people are concerned. The 40 million Americans that I mentioned at the top of the show, these are our neighbors. These are the people that we go to church with and grocery shop with, and our kids play with their kids. And so I think people are just deeply concerned. I'm certainly one of them, and it's Christmas time. And, this is a terrible time of the year to be worried about whether or not you're going to have a place to stay in, the next couple of weeks. So I appreciate everything you're doing. And I love the fact that you're not only just trying to work with the industry side, because a lot of times, and I've done a lot of trade association work, as you know, a lot of times we get accused of only caring about the industry, but we don't advocate for the people that are utilizing the industry. So I love the fact that you're trying to work both those angles. And we'll get you back on too, man, first of the year for another update on this. I think this is, I agree with you. I think this is going to be continuing to be a story.
Yeah. Algenon, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about it. And anytime, it's an important issue. It's a foundational issue for our society. We've got to figure this out. And, food and shelter, what gets more basic than that? And we do have to figure this out. And it's interesting. The housing advocates that I've talked to feel the same way. It's not about it. We don't know. None of us want residents to be caught in the middle. We want folks to be housed, and we want everybody to be taken care of, from both sides of the aisle. So, I mean, that's one of the great things is we can agree on that. What we might disagree about is how we get there, but we will get there. And, that's where compromise and negotiation, that's where that comes into play. And I'm feeling really good about what I'm hearing out of Washington right now. And I hope that continues.
No, I think you're right. And again, Jon, I appreciate you being here, man. Have a good night.
You too. Thanks.
All right. So you guys just heard it first from Jon Lowder, president of the Piedmont Triad Apartment Association, just breaking down this looming evictions crisis that we're dealing with here in the country. And so it is a crisis, but it's also something that we can prevent. It's something that we can actually do something about, but we certainly need Congress to act. I know there's been a lot of partisan conflict between Democrats and Republicans right now in DC. They can't seem to come to an agreement on a bill, but right now in Washington, it does sound like there's some optimism around a $900 billion package. I know Congress signaled today that they are going to stay in Washington through the weekend. They've even committed to staying all the way up until Christmas. So they will not be adjourning on Friday the 18th as previously agreed upon. So I would encourage you, you hear me talk a lot about restaurants and small business. You hear me talk about the housing and the eviction crisis. We've also got a crisis with our state and local government right now. They need additional support. So everybody across the whole country is in a lot of pain. And so that means all eyes right now on Washington, D.C., because they are literally the only group that can sort of save us. And so if you care about any of the things that you heard about tonight, if you're concerned about it, I would ask you tomorrow morning, pick up the phone, call your representative, call Senator Byrd, call Senator Tillis. I know you probably think those phone calls don't matter, but they actually do. The more phone calls they get, the more emails they receive, the more letters they see show up. They know that you're paying attention and that you care about this issue. And so if you really want to do something to support not only Jon Lowder's efforts and so many other housing advocates, make a phone call to your representative. Let them know you want them to get a deal worked out immediately. And I also agree with Jon's comments that I do think you'll see another larger stimulus package once the new administration comes in on January the 20th, and they have an opportunity to start negotiating a little bit further. All right. So make sure you check that out. Also, again, go check out the YouTube channel, subscribe. We do have a new episode up with Mitch Koka, who is the senior political analyst at the John Locke Foundation. We talked about the voter ID rule that you'll most likely see get reintroduced by North Carolina lawmakers next year. Go check that out. That episode is available right now. And then tomorrow, I've got the senior editor at KPASA will be locking in with me. We're going to be talking about what's happening within our Hispanic community. That's an area of our community we don't talk a lot about. But their small businesses, their restaurants, their families are in a lot of pain right now. And so Ms. Flores is going to be locking in with me tomorrow, and we'll be doing an update on what's happening within the Hispanic community right here in your backyard. Until then, y'all stay locked in. All right, man.